Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je me présente, je suis Yves, je suis professeure de sociologie ici à Paris-Cité. Et donc j'ai le plaisir de vous accueillir pour cette masterclass de Graham Smith sur les assemblées citoyennes climatiques qui sera discutée par Yves Sintomer. Et donc on est très content à Paris-Cité de pouvoir faire vivre de cette manière le partenariat entre Sciences Po et Paris-Cité. C'est un moyen de se faire rencontrer des étudiants et des chercheurs de nos deux institutions. Donc il y a des étudiants de différents masters à Paris-Cité, du master sociologie et philosophie politique et du master énergie, écologie et société, qui sont des masters rattachés à deux laboratoires. Le laboratoire de changement social et politique, le LCSP, et le LEAD, le laboratoire interdisciplinaire des énergies de demain. Et du côté de Sciences Po, vous êtes différents masters d'Environmental Policy, International Development, International Governance, de l'école urbaine, de l'école des affaires publiques. Il y a aussi des étudiants de bachelor, des doctorants. Donc voilà, on est vraiment contents pouvoir vous réunir autour de cette conférence qu'on a voulu aussi ouvrir plus largement. Et j'espère qu'il y aura d'autres espaces comme ça de débat à l'avenir. Et il me semble d'autant plus important d'avoir ces espaces de débat sur la thématique qu'a proposé Graham, qui propose d'articuler en fait deux des grandes problématiques ou crises du moment, à la fois la question démocratique et la question climatique, en partant du principe que on pourra apporter des solutions à la crise écologique seulement par une refonte de nos pratiques, institutions démocratiques. Et rien qu'en prononçant ces termes, notamment celui du climat, on serait déjà dans la liste noire des termes à ne pas employer pour avoir des recherches financées d'un point de vue fédéral aux États-Unis. Donc c'est d'autant plus important de mener des recherches et d'avoir des discussions sur ces enjeux dans le contexte actuel, de recul démocratique et de montée des obscurantismes un peu partout dans le monde. Donc c'est pourquoi on a choisi de maintenir cette conférence aujourd'hui. Alors vous savez, sûrement c'est aussi une journée de mobilisation dans l'enseignement supérieur et la recherche. Aujourd'hui, ces lieux étaient occupés par les étudiants, enfin bloqués par les étudiants, pour pouvoir aller en manifestation ensuite, on est certain en revenir. Et c'est aussi une mobilisation qui est importante parce que pour pouvoir mener de la recherche sur ces thématiques ou sur d'autres, il faut aussi avoir des moyens. Et c'est aussi ces moyens qui sont en cause aujourd'hui. Et si on a aussi voulu maintenir, c'est parce que la conférence, parce qu'on l'avait déjà reportée une première fois, parce que Graham vient spécialement de Londres pour ça. Donc voilà, c'était aussi, merci beaucoup Graham, de faire cet effort. Je voulais vous dire aussi un mot sur le contexte de préparation de cette masterclass. C'est une conférence qu'on a préparée à l'automne avec Bernard Weber et Charlotte Alperne de Sciences Po, et avec Philippe Chagnal, notre collègue de Paris-Cité, qui est décédé brutalement en décembre dernier, ce qui nous a beaucoup affecté, autant l'équipe enseignante que les étudiants ici. C'est Philippe qui m'avait proposé d'organiser cette masterclass avec lui quand les collègues de Sciences Po nous ont sollicités. C'est avec Philippe que nous avons rencontré Graham en septembre pour discuter du contenu et des modalités de cette conférence. C'est aussi avec Philippe et Marie Cuilleret que nous avons préparé les étudiants du master sociologie et philosophie politique en discutant des textes de Graham. Donc voilà, je voulais profiter de ce mot d'accueil aussi pour rendre un hommage à Philippe Chagnal et évoquer sa mémoire. Alors maintenant, je vais passer la parole à Charlotte Alperne qui vous allez nous dire un mot d'accueil depuis Sciences Po. Et je voulais juste vous dire que la conférence sera en anglais, mais vous pouvez vous sentir libre de parler dans la langue de votre choix dans le débat. C'est pour ça que j'ai commencé en français, comme tout le monde c'est à l'aise comme ça pour pouvoir parler comme il le souhaite. Et puis, Graham a envie d'améliorer son français, donc il sera ravi de vous entendre en français, sachant qu'on pourra traduire si jamais il y a besoin d'un peu d'aide.
In France, we speak French.
Merci Louise. Bon, je vais faire les deux en fait. Je vais commencer en français puis je finirai en anglais. Merci beaucoup Héloïse d'avoir organisé cette conférence. Bonsoir à toutes et tous. Alors cette conférence, en fait, elle est effectivement organisée dans le cadre d'un échange et d'un partenariat avec l'Université Paris-Cité et Sciences Po. Côté Sciences Po, en fait, c'est un lieu qui s'appelle l'Institut pour les transformations environnementales, donc j'assure la direction, qui s'occupe d'organiser et d'accueillir en fait ces professeurs invités. Je travaille d'ailleurs dans cet institut avec certains de mes collègues ici présents, Marc Robert, Catherine Villard, la directrice du LEAD. Donc on travaille de manière conjointe pour assurer un renforcement des enseignements, des recherches interdisciplinaires et travailler conjointement en fait au développement de ces thématiques entre nos deux universités. Et donc dans le cadre de ce partenariat avec l'Université Paris-Cité, on a un programme en fait d'échange, notamment de l'accueil de profs invités. C'est dans ce cadre-là que Graham Smith est venu au semestre dernier, au semestre d'automne. Et donc nous avons des appels réguliers pour que chaque année on ait un, deux professeurs invités qui viennent dans différentes disciplines. Donc Graham, c'était en sciences politiques. Mais vous aviez aussi une économiste qui était présente au semestre dernier. Et à la rentrée, nous aurons quelqu'un qui sera en croisant la littérature, les études de genre et les questions environnementales. Et donc à chaque fois, en fait, le principe est qu'on ait à la fois des masterclass qui soient donnés sur notre site à Sciences Po, qui n'est pas très très loin d'ici, mais qu'on vienne aussi à l'Université Paris-Cité donner des masterclass ici, parce qu'on sait que c'est important finalement de pouvoir nous adresser à l'ensemble de nos communautés étudiantes. Et donc c'est notamment Mathilde Croquet, que je remercie, qui est ici présente, qui est vraiment à l'organisation, à la manœuvre de toutes ces actualités, ces événements, et en particulier ces masterclass. Alors peut-être je ne veux pas être trop longue. Je souhaite simplement dire, and now we'll switch to English maybe, thanks for coming all the way here, crossing the channel. Since the Brexit, it's not that easy a trip to make. It's becoming much more. We're all waiting now for the USA that we'll have to sign to go to the UK very, very soon. But anyway, thank you very much for being here. And look forward to hearing more about the promise of citizens' assemblies and about hearing also about the carbon state, which I'm particularly interested in. Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone for tonight.
Yes, thank you. So, I will introduce Graham Smith. Donc, I'm Bernard Hebert from Sciences Po, l'Institut pour les transformations environnementales. Et Graham is a professor in the Center for the Study of Democracy in the School of Social Sciences, and now is mostly working for the KNOCA network, is a knowledge network on climate assemblies. In French, KNOCA is a very special, you agree, huh? It's an acronym, but Réseau pour la connaissance des assemblées climatiques. RECAC, I think it's not better in French. And for those who are not familiar with KNOCA has around 750 members from a variety of backgrounds, practitioners, academic, including policymakers, and civil society activists. So you have almost everybody. And it's written on your website that KNOCA is the go-to place for seeking those rigorous, widely sources input on climate assembly practices, and you are searching for the best practices. And you answer to this very difficult question: why KNOCA? Why? Because despite this empowerment of participants, coupling between assemblies and climate policy, cycles and policy systems has often been weak. And I'm sure that you, Sintomer, will add things regarding this issue. And to finish with you, I think that, I don't know if it's finished this project, Scolio. It was an interesting project with digital networks and the so-called social media. And you've tried to redesign comment platforms to promote dialogue that is more reasoned and intellectually humble. So you are the specialist of the humility. And pour terminer, and you can come, I will leave, une anecdote aussi, parce que j'ai rencontré Philippe Chagnal plusieurs fois dans ma carrière, et quand on avait repris contact à l'occasion de ce repas, j'étais content de retrouver. C'est un allié pour les gens qui font la philosophie, Philippe Chagnal, parce qu'il était un passeur entre la sociologie morale, la sociologie politique et la philosophie morale et la philosophie politique. Et une des dernières fois où je l'avais rencontré, donc c'était avant cette rencontre pour préparer cette rencontre, c'était à Caen, une université dans laquelle il a été. C'était une conférence sur les Digital Humanities, et juste avant la conférence, c'est lui qui devait modérer, il était à côté de moi, puis il me dit 20 minutes, pas plus. Puis je lui dis, mais Philippe, si tu veux, je fais ça en 5. Non, 20 minutes. Et j'ai fait une conférence en 5 minutes. So, you have more than 5 minutes, but please come. No more than 10. You are humble enough. Voilà.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I spent most of the last semester at Sciences Po and really very much enjoyed Paris, and I was really sorry not to be able to do this this masterclass because of family reasons, and so it's really nice to come back and have this opportunity to talk with you, and also to hear. I'm always a bit worried about what Yves is going to say about my work, but that's okay. I'll survive. On this slide, you can see two logos. One of them is the University of Westminster. So I'm primarily an academic. My background is in academia. I've studied participatory and deliberative politics. I do a lot of work on democratic innovation. And during that period, during my I guess for the last 25 years, one of the things I've been looking at is what are now called citizens' assemblies. And I'll sort of say a bit more about those. And I had this very strange thing happen to me, that as an academic, it turned out that the things I was studying were useful to people, which is always a bit of a shock to an academic, I think. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, I was invited by the European Climate Foundation to establish this thing called the Knowledge Network on Climate Assembly, KNOCA. And this is not an academic project. It's an attempt to learn very quickly from practice and try and help improve the commissioning, the design, the delivery, and the follow-up and the evaluation of climate assemblies so that they have more impact. So this is this is where I spend a lot of my time talking to people who are working in policy or in civil society who are either trying to organise or advocate for citizens' assemblies and trying to do them well. And one of my favourite things is telling people not to do these things when they're doing them for bad reasons, or they're doing them because they haven't got the capacity to actually deliver. Anyway, one of the things, as I've been doing this, I've come to realise that my understanding of what a citizens' assembly is has been challenged. And I want to share that with you, and I want to share with you the kind of different perspectives. And I've kind of provocatively titled these kind of extreme perspectives as one side, a sort of citizens' assemblies for good governance, and another, and this is a quote, it isn't something I made up, that they are a revolutionary confrontation with the carbon state. And I want to try and make sense of how these two things can coexist, just by giving you a sense of what's happening out in the world of assembly practice. So just in case you don't know, what is a citizens' assembly? It has two key features. One is that it selects people by democratic lottery. That means the people who are in there look like, according to certain criteria that you've used to choose them, look like the wider population. They are not your usual activists, they are not your usual lobbyists. This is a very, very unusual space, very diverse space. I can talk some more about that later. But the second characteristic is that they are facilitated to deliberate, which means that they share information with each other, they get input from technical experts and from advocates, they learn from each other, from their own experience. They reason together as equals and come up with practical judgments about what should happen. They produce a set of recommendations. And generally, that is on policy or constitutional issues, but as I will discuss, there's been some change in the way that these things have been used. This is probably the most famous assembly in in the world, which is the Irish Citizens' Assembly. I know the French would want to contest that and say that theirs was more famous, but But this is the French, and the Irish Assembly was famous for making a recommendation on liberalising abortion, which helped in the process of changing the constitution. And they did the same thing for same-sex marriage. They've also done a climate assembly. They've recently done a biodiversity assembly. And these have actually had quite profound impact on Irish politics. And we can talk about why that's the case. I love this photo for two reasons. One is, well, for a number of reasons. One is it gives you a sense of what it looks like. But the other is the carpet. I just think that, so basically the only room big enough to take a citizens' assembly is this large hotel in just on the outskirts of Dublin, which is used for weddings. And this carpet it's been there since they've been doing it. If you go down close to it, it smells of beer. And you just wonder what they would be able to do if you actually built them a space for citizens. But they managed to do this brilliant work in this space. Anyway, it's just a nice story. I just think, I think if I had to spend 4 or 5 days in there, I'd have a headache. But there we go. So I think the second most famous is the Convention Citoyenne pour le Climat. And I just put that up there because I've got a slide which kind of just talks us through the process. So you've got a sense of what an assembly does if you don't know already. So citizens selected by lottery in France, using age, gender, education, job, their urban, rural, where they're from geographically, and the remit to actually think about what it would mean for France to take its commitments to the Paris Agreement seriously, cutting greenhouse gases by 40% by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. So that, if you like, is the setup. Those citizens come together. They spent 7 weekends together, which is it is a long time for anyone to consider any area of policy, if we're honest. They took evidence as a group from over 137 experts and advocates. They were supported by a group of fact checkers. They deliberated in different areas of climate policy and created a set of recommendations, which were then received by government. These recommendations were for laws, regulations, and referendums. And interestingly, this isn't done all the time, but they came back a few months later to review what the government had done. But this is, I just wanted to give you a sense of, for those that weren't aware, that's what it looks like. That's the kind of bare skeleton of what an assembly is and what it looks like. It's very strange, it's very creaky up here.
It's not a carpet.
No, it's not, it's slightly different. So, the OECD, which I'll be coming back to in a moment, I've talked about there being a deliberative wave. And so, in the time since Ireland's first Citizens' Assembly in 2016-18, we've had something like 800 other deliberative processes like Citizens' Assemblies happening around the world. And since the French Convention on the Climate, we've actually had over 200 climate assemblies happen, most of them in Europe. This map is, sorry about the thing in the way of that. This map is slightly out of date now. There's been 2 national assemblies in Norway. There's been assemblies in North Macedonia. There's one happening in Turkey. So it's been spreading. It's spreading east and south as well. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, but it's still quite niche. I mean, 200 isn't that many. I mean, let's be honest, given how many public authorities there are, but it is a really interesting phenomenon. That phenomenon, I think, has become even more interesting because citizens' assemblies are being put forward as a solution to dealing with issues like climate and other wicked issues by the strangest of people, as in bringing them individually they're not strange, but together they're quite strange, which is on one side the OECD, which is an organisation which aims to promote good governance amongst its members, and at the same time by Roger Hallam, who, if you don't know, is the person who invented Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. He's in prison at the moment for 6 years for suggesting to people that they might want to block the motorway. I mean, it's completely ridiculous. He will be out because our prisons are too full, and so everyone's being released early. But it's still it's kind of quite it's an incredible example of the repressive state. But just to give you a sense of the different ways they talk about this, for the OECD, this is very much about better policy outcomes. It's about enabling policymakers to make hard choices. It's about enhancing trust among citizens and government. This is a discourse of good governance. We want to do assemblies because they will help us do politics better. We need to do assemblies because they will improve the liberal democratic system, our representative institutions. At the same time, we have, oh no, I can't read the whole thing, but we've got Roger saying, the zombie carbon state will soon collapse as citizens' assemblies are used by civil society to create their own alternative governing institutions. That is, to undermine them rather than prop up the regime. It strikes me as really strange that within 4 or 5 years of climate assembly practice, we've got a group of people around the OECD talking about these things being a vehicle for good governance, and another group of people around Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, other groups of activists, who see this as a way of confronting the carbon state as they see it, as a way of taking on entrenched interests. And it's that, I guess, that I want to kind of like try to make sense of today, and try and make sense of how can that be? It's really unusual that something which is just as simple as democratic lottery and deliberation could be the answer for OECD and for Roger Hallam. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what's happened as I see it, and how we might make sense of that. So what I want to talk about is the sort of trajectories of climate assemblies, and this is very much from me sitting in the middle of all of this. For the Irish Assembly, it's time limited. It's something that will happen for a number of weekends on a particular topic, and then it will disappear, and then they might run another one. So in Ireland, they've now run 5 or 6. France now onto its second assembly, having done the end of life. It's done a bunch of regional and municipal authorities also run assemblies which look like that. And I think 95% of the assemblies that we look at look like this. They are time limited, they're ad hoc. Interestingly, oh no, I was just going to show another. So this is, if you just look at the blue, examples, and I'll talk about the green in a second. These are national level assemblies that have been run by states. And you can see there's been 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I should have counted them before, at least 10. Maybe there's more now because this is a slightly old slide. But the reason I wanted to put this up, the length of the blue is the amount of time that they spend on it. So they can be very, very different. So the one that happened in France and the one that happened in Scotland in total met over 8 weekends. The one that happened in Finland only met for 3 days. So these are very different types of things, very, very different types of instances of them. So there's a great variety within this idea of government-sponsored ad hoc processes. What's interesting as well is this way of thinking about assemblies was also the way Extinction Rebellion initially thought about this. So they were on the streets demanding that government commission a citizens' assembly on the climate and ecological crisis. It was very clear it was something that government should do. So that in their way of thinking, they were also projecting this idea of this is a technology that governments will do, and it will be something which is run as part of government business. Obviously, they had quite a radical suggestion about how it should work. I like this. I really like this. You can't see it properly. It's a real shame. There's actually a policeman standing behind this this citizens' assembly now. And this photograph was taken when Extinction Rebellion occupied London for 2 weeks, and they occupied Whitehall, which is between basically this the bit between where the Prime Minister lives, Downing Street, and Parliament was completely occupied with people with banners about citizens' assemblies. And it was one of the highlights of my life when one of these eager young activists came up and said, "Can I talk to you about citizens' assemblies?" You've just come to the right person. But you know, so it was really odd to me that you would even, I couldn't have imagined 2 years before that this was even possible. But again, they were arguing for a more radical version of what we'd already seen. And then what we started to see in the last year or two is the emergence of more permanent structures. So this still has the same logic, something that is part of government infrastructure, but becomes a permanent part of our way of doing things, part of governance. This, on the right-hand side, is an illustration of how the Brussels Permanent Climate Assembly works. They have an annual assembly, a different group of 100 citizens each year. They have a process where the previous assembly selects the issue for the next assembly to look at. They have a really quite sophisticated way of reviewing what the government is doing. And that's an example. There's an example in Milan. It doesn't work quite the same way, but it's again an annual cycle. We've got some other cities that are introducing these annual permanent assemblies. And you have another approach, which is you develop a specialist agency. So Baden-Württemberg has a special agency for citizen participation, and they will work with any level of government within the region, or with a state enterprise to organise a citizens' assembly process. So they don't have a permanent assembly; they have the permanent capacity to run an assembly. But this is about developing a sort of permanency within this. But I think it still fits the same logic. It's just taking it further, and you can see why you might move here, because one of the criticisms, or two criticisms of assemblies are, one, of course, they're there for one moment. Of course, the conditions change. Climate is going to be an evolving issue. We need to have an assembly in place, or we need to have the capacity in place to deal with things as they change. And secondly, if you only run one assembly, the public administration isn't really used to understanding how it works. The assembly appears, it disappears, and it never becomes part of their way of working. This is a way of trying to bring an assembly into the annual processes of public authorities. And then I think we've got a third category, which is, I'd be interested to know what he thinks about this, but I still see this within a sort of government-centric way of thinking about assemblies, which is, okay, we make these permanent, but they become part of the legislature. And we see this particularly in the UK, where we've got this very anachronistic House of Lords. There's a very strong debate now for that House of Lords to be replaced by a House of Citizens. We see in Scotland, where they've only got one chamber, the argument that there should be a second chamber for which again is a House of Citizens. And this can take various forms, but it is part of the state infrastructure. So I'm kind of like pushing this argument a bit further, but still the same. The idea is that this is something that is an organised part of the state. This is just a more, if you like, a more radical version of that argument. So for me, I guess the emergence of permanent assemblies was a little bit of a surprise, a pleasant surprise. But it wasn't something that I was necessarily imagining 5 years ago when I started doing this work. But it's a logical explanation. Again, these kind of arguments for a legislature by lot, you can see how they come out of from the assembly argument. If this works, why not do it on a sort of more legislative basis? I have debated with people. I think there are problems with this idea, which we can talk about, but it's not the main point of this presentation. So for most people, that's the kind of story of assemblies. But actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, and has become more complicated in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think in ways that are becoming quite exciting. And this is assembly practice that is happening beyond the state. And if you looked at we looked at this earlier, there are 4 examples here that are in green. And they're in green because they are organised by a different body. They're organised by civil society organisations. So this is really odd, because this was originally a technology that most of us thought was something that would be delivered by government, but is actually now being delivered by, or is being commissioned and delivered by civil society organisations. And it takes a number of forms. The first one is kind of quite easy to understand. this is civil society organisations that are organising these assemblies in order to try and persuade government to also organise assemblies, or to persuade government to move its policy in a certain way, but seeing assemblies as something which governments could be using. So an example here, the Polish one at the top, was an assembly on energy costs. It was really, really quiet until the Ukraine war happened, just as it was starting, and of course that became a much more pertinent issue. But the people who organised it, an NGO called the Shipyard Foundation, their aim was to show that assemblies could work in the Polish context. So I've actually run an assembly. I ran an assembly just after Brexit in the UK called the Citizens' Assembly on Brexit. What a great title. And we were looking at the relationship between the UK and Europe after Brexit had happened. We looked at trade and we looked at migration. And the whole idea of that was to affect the debate. But it was also to show that assemblies could be done in the UK. It's amazing how many politicians say, oh, they happen there, but they can't happen here. So lots of civil society organisations do them, if you like, as demonstration projects. And that actually happened in Ireland. That's the reason that assemblies were picked up as an idea, because a bunch of academics ran one to show that it could be done during the economic crisis there. The German assembly, which happened, was very much trying to affect the two federal elections back. It was trying to affect the debate in the elections and also the agreements of the parties, and was really also there to show how assemblies could work in a German context. And just a more local one in Skopje, there's been an assembly which again was run by a civil society organisation, trying to push government into thinking about how to do democracy and climate policy in a more participatory way. So again, I think we can kind of understand this because it's civil society organisations using their platform to try and get the state to take this on as a practice. So even though it's civil society, it sort of still fits the same logic because the ultimate aim is state action. And then we start to get interesting, I think. The other stuff is really interesting, of course, but this is even more interesting from a sort of sociological perspective or political perspective. The first is we're starting to see non-state organisations run assemblies. And these are coming in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, including one example within universities. And Emily, who's here, is someone who's very active in this area in France. A number of universities in France, and a couple in Switzerland, and we're hoping to do one in the UK as well, have actually, with their students and sometimes with staff as well, are actually using assemblies within their organisations to try and improve the democratic decision making within it. We have an example here of a union. The airplane's logo is a union in the UK where they're running an assembly of workers to try and figure out how does the airline industry move towards a carbon transition. Because it's a really difficult position. If you are a worker in the airline industry, what does the green transition mean to you? An example of a pension fund in Norway, in the Netherlands, where the trustees realise they're very good at working out fiduciary duty. They're very good at working out what's the best return on investment for money. They don't really know how to balance that against social and governance and environmental issues. So they actually created a diverse assembly of beneficiaries who could give them advice about how to balance that, because they had sent out surveys and that wasn't working, and they found this is a way of doing that. And Democracy Next, which is a relatively new organisation, is doing this with museums. It's also doing it with the large cooperative Mondragon in Spain, and they're trying to push forward this idea of assemblies happening outside of the space of the state. I think this is really interesting of private sector organisations and civil society organisations using it as a way of thinking, of rethinking their governance. I also put this up there because the person who runs Democracy Next used to run the OECD programme on these processes. She invented the idea of the deliberative wave, and she actually got burnt out by the process and actually decided that she didn't trust these. She met a lot of politicians and a lot of civil servants and decided that that was not going to be the way forward for this, and we needed to do things differently. So she's been pushing in this kind of non-government space. Then two more, which I find particularly interesting, and I don't think I could have imagined these 5 years back. And these are civil society commissioned assemblies, where their aim is not to shape, they would like government to change, but they're trying to create a broader public debate. They're trying to shift public discourse. And I've got a number of examples here, but the one I'll talk to you about is the one that I've just come back from. Was there for a weekend of theirs in Oslo. Is the Norwegian Assembly, which is looking at whether Norway has a special duty, the duties Norway has in relation to the climate crisis, given that its wealth is built on oil and gas. They have an oil. The reason Norwegians live in the style they live in is because they pay so little tax, is because they have a national wealth fund which is based on their oil and gas industry. They made a fortune out of the Ukraine war, an absolute fortune. It was really good for the Norwegians, and no one in Norway talks about this. The Norwegians have this strange view that they're the greenest people on the planet, but they seem to live their green lifestyle based on a oil and gas sovereign wealth fund. They're really nice people, so I don't want to push it too far. But a group of humanitarian and climate organisations said, actually, we need to have a public debate about this. Our politicians are not willing to talk about this. We want to open up a public debate. We're going to do this through a citizens' assembly. Because that's a way of it not being seen as, oh, it's those same old environmental or humanitarian organisations. But well, let's see what ordinary people think about this. Again, we've had in the UK a People's Plan for Nature, which was 3 of our most conservative NGOs who work on conservation were trying to create a new public debate about the value of nature, and they turned to a citizens' assembly. And I found this really interesting that organisations that are known for doing sort of advocacy work are actually creating these spaces. And we can talk about this a bit more, but what's really interesting is, as commissioners, they're creating a space that they don't control. And they're creating a space where the recommendations that come out of this will sometimes not be what they necessarily want. But they think they feel it's worth taking that risk because they need to open up this space. And they don't have to commit to implementing everything that citizens say. They obviously have to take it seriously and justify why they won't necessarily take things forward. But I just think it's a really interesting development of this, that civil society organisations think these assemblies have value for opening up political debate that would otherwise be closed. I'm kind of presenting to you this as a sort of sociologically this is happening. It's normative implications we can debate. And then we get onto something which is, I just never expected this, which is this sort of idea that the carbon state, as we see it, the reference to the carbon state being a state whose capacity is based on fossil fuel on continual fossil fuel extraction, that we cannot trust the carbon state to help us deal with the climate crisis. And in particular, these are activists like Roger Hallam who can see, I think the technical term is, this is going to be a shit show. This is going to be, we are living in a warming world. We are going to have to learn to govern ourselves in a warming world. We can't pretend it's just going to somehow disappear. We can't mitigate it. I mean, we can mitigate it to a certain extent, but this is bringing real problems down the line. And they have actually started to say, okay, we are going to start organising. We need to start organising separate from government. We need to start organising in opposition to government. We need to start organising not as a protest, but actually building infrastructure so that we can respond to this crisis. Democracy, as it is practiced now, has got us into this crisis. We need a different form of democracy to actually manage what's coming down the line. And so we've seen an organisation called Humanity, which is the nice cartoons, who have been arguing for, they both got similar models. And Assemble is the model of Roger Hallam. And their model is something like local people's assemblies, anybody who wants to come and organise and talk about what's happening in our locality and potentially organise to do things, but also to raise those issues which you don't think which need to be dealt with at a higher level that you can't solve. And then they want to collate these, mostly around cost of living and climate and systemic racism, the kind of things that are coming out. They want those things to be looked at and dealt with by a citizens' assembly. So they kind of have this really interesting model which combines local mobilisation with a kind of sortition-based at the national level, and they actually are very serious about we are going to have to build a new infrastructure for dealing with the climate crisis, one in which communities are able to respond and be ready in the locality, but also we need some way of trying to work through some of these issues that are emerging from these communities which they can't deal with locally. And their answer to that is citizens' assemblies. So this is my conundrum. My job was so much easier when it was just governments doing this stuff. As an academic, as a practitioner, this is fine. I can talk to these different audiences about how we kind of can ensure the assemblies they're building, whether they're civil society or government, are robust. One of the really interesting things about KNOCA is we will have on our call, about, I don't know, what did we have a call about yesterday? We were talking about how to support assembly members after an assembly ends. And we had someone from a government there, but we also had an XR activist on the call. It's really interesting that you can create these spaces to talk about these issues with people who would not normally be in the same space. But KNOCA can manage that. But if you scratch the surface too much, then obviously very different theories of change emerge. So I just want to end by thinking about how do we make sense of this. And I think we make sense of this by starting to recognise that these activists and policymakers are thinking about sortition and deliberation, which are the two key. Sorry, sortition is another word for democratic lottery. That they're thinking about sortition and deliberation in very different ways. So sortition can be understood in there's a number of different ways, and Yves has got an excellent book on sortition, which where he talks about this in much more detail. One way of thinking about sortition is as a method of political equality. Sortition is an equal opportunity for you to be chosen. Everybody has that equal opportunity. It's a different way of us thinking about political equality. There's one way of thinking about sortition, which is about creating a body which is descriptively representative, that looks like the wider population. And for some people, depending upon the size of these things, they'll start talking about statistical representation. For other people, sortition is really important because of its function of generating diversity. And this is where, assemblies are so much different from any other political space you'll see, just that diversity of people in that same space. And that has social and cognitive value, which I'll talk about in a second in relation to deliberation. So there's a bunch of stuff here about equality, representation and diversity. But also, if we go back to the reason that the Greeks were interested in sortition, it was actually a way of dealing with the problems of oligarchy. It was a way of dealing with problems of warring families who were basically ruining the state by fighting each other all the time, and governing was a real problem in Greece. And the way that it was dealt with was one of the ways it was dealt with was introducing sortition. So sortition here was being used as a way of challenging entrenched interests. It was a way of making sure you could create political spaces which couldn't be dominated by one particular interest, one particular family, one particular group within society. Now that is a very different reason for sortition than achieving descriptive representation or having diversity. I mean, that diversity and descriptive representation may be secondary on that, but actually what's really important here is it's a way of stopping entrenched interest dominating. And then the final one, I guess, is the people involved in these processes are unconstrained by electoral dynamics. If we think that one of the problems with dealing with climate, which and other long-term issues is that politicians have to operate on a 3, 4, 5 year cycle. Then let's create spaces where those people are not constrained in the same way. And what I want to argue, I guess, is my sense is that it is the kind of descriptive and diversity arguments that, if you read the OECD, that's what they're saying the value of sortition brings. In fact, they talk about representative deliberative institutions. And they're celebrating that sort of cognitive diversity and social diversity. If you listen to someone like Roger Hallam, he's much more talking about how do we fight against entrenched interests? How do we operate, how do we break this problem of the electoral cycle in a way that remains democratic? So what's interesting here, I think, is there are different interpretations and meanings given to sortition and what we understand by that. And I think the same is true also about deliberation. I think if we look at the kind of work of anyone in this area, I think everyone agrees with the first point. You know, sortition, and this comes from, is a quote from Ulrich Preuss and, I forgot his name. It's Klaus Hofer. Oh, Klaus Hofer, thank you. How can I forget Klaus Hofer? That's really terrible. And here they argue this very nice argument that deliberation creates a space where you take other people seriously, the arguments of others seriously. It's a place where you take facts seriously, and it's a place where you take the future seriously. And it's a way of us interacting. That means that you're other regarding, fact regarding, and future regarding. I think most people who are interested in deliberation would agree that those are kind of like core elements. And then you see arguments that this is a space where people begin to understand each other. It's, if you like, one of my friends refers to citizens' assemblies as anti-polarization machines. There are ways of actually creating a space where people from very different perspectives can actually work together, can be creative together. And so it's a mutual understanding process. For others, it's about collective intelligence. This is a way of, if you like, the wisdom of the crowd. It's a way of generating a better decision. And for others, it's about reasoned agreement. And I think all of that you find in the work of the OECD, and governments will use this kind of ways of talking about it. But I think what's really interesting when you read the work of people like Roger Hallam and you listen to him, deliberation is a quality of something that goes on within the assembly, but it's understood within a wider politics of conflict. But actually what you're doing here is you're purposely creating this deliberative space. If you like, it has a performative role within a broader politics of confronting established interests, confronting the state. So again, I think that they're thinking about the function and the way of thinking about deliberation in a very different way. Now, I thought I was onto something really interesting here, and kind of like, you know, kind of that I was thinking about this in a way that others hadn't. And then I remembered that Yves and I forgot my first name. Nabila Abbas have written something along the similar kinds of lines, which is way more elegant. You know, I hate to say that in public, but I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about it, and maybe Yves will talk a bit more about this, or we could bring it up. But we have, if you like, assemblies are being caught up with competing imaginaries, competing ways of seeing the world. And one of those, they I think were talking particularly about the French practice, but one of those is sort of the imaginary of deliberative democracy. And in this imaginary, what we're doing is we're looking. I think you should come up and explain this, but I'll do a really bad job, and then you can explain what you really meant. Deliberative democracy is this kind of idea that we can work with the institutions we have. We need just to improve the deliberative quality of the political system. And so in that way, it's a kind of, you can see how OECD ties in and others tie into that way of thinking about democracy. But basically, the institutions of liberal constitutionalism are the basic structures within which we can do our politics. The second, and I guess there's less of this in the examples that I've been looking at, although maybe some of the civil society ones might capture this, which is the sort of anti-politics view, which is that politics is corrupt. Politics is if you like, has proved itself to be worthless. We need to create. The thing about assemblies is they're somehow not corrupted by that kind of idea of existing of the sort of existing institutions. We see a bit of that, I think, in civil society discourse. And actually, maybe we see a bit of it in the sortition legislature arguments as well. And then the third one is the kind of radical democracy argument. And I think this is where it chimes with what we're seeing definitely amongst Roger Hallam's of this world and the others, which is that we should really understand sortition and deliberation as part of a radical politics of confrontation. Now, I think this is a really nice way of thinking about it. I still am quite shocked and amazed that within like the last 3 to 4 years, we've actually confined OECD all the way through to these radical climate activists looking at this particular technology, this small way, this kind of quite clever way of doing politics, very interesting way of doing politics, as a way of us getting out of some of the problems we're in now. I don't want to make, we'll talk about this in the questions about how, inverted commas, how realistic this is in politics, but I just think it's a really interesting moment that we would find that. I could not have believed 5 years ago, 6 years ago, that this would be the case, that at this particular moment in time, this institution has become an object of interest for the OECD and for radical assembly. So just before I finish, I've put some of the thoughts around this, although not in this lecture, but I've tried to capture some of what I've been talking about today in this book. We need to talk about climate. This book has 4 virtues. It is free. It is short. It has pictures. And there is an audio book as well, so you don't even have to read it. So please do happy download it. It basically captures the learning that we caught from the KNOCA project. This stuff I'm talking about you today is sort of talked about towards the end, but it's something I'm sort of dwelling on at the moment. And I'm really, as you can see, I'm trying to make sense of it in front of you. This is sort of quite new, and it kind of does, I'm not quite sure exactly how to understand it. I think this, recognising that there are different interpretations of sortition and deliberation is one way. I think the kind of thinking about these imaginaries might be another. But I offer it to you as a way of thinking, you know, this kind of, when we see people writing about assemblies, whether it's in academia, or whether it's in the newspapers, or whether it's on social media, it's way more complicated than the debates that are actually going on most of the time. Because most of us in our mind have this idea that this is something being organised by governments. We have something like the confrontation citoyen pour le climat in our minds, and we've made up our mind, yes or no on that. But actually, what I hope I've showed you today is that it's way more complicated, that it's way more interesting. I've got no idea where this is going, but I think it's, I want to share with you because I'm a bit of a nerd and I think it's quite exciting. Anyway, at that point, thank you very much.
Now I will introduce Yves Sintomer. First of all, I'd like to thank you a lot, Yves, for accepting this role as discussant. And Yves Sintomer is professor of political science at the Université Paris VIII, and he is a member of CRESPA, le Centre de Recherche Sociologique et Politique de Paris. He is also an associate fellow of VIII College, University of Oxford, University of Neuchâtel, and the Free University of Brussels. And Yves has been working for many years on the issue of participatory and deliberative democracy, both from a political theory and a political sociology perspective. He has devoted a significant part of his research to the question of sortitions in politics, organizing a dialogue between politists and historians on this issue. More recently, Yves Sintomer has been working on the history and current changes on political representation, with a particular focus on representation beyond elections, and is currently working on a global history of democracy from a non-Western centric perspective. Yves has published numerous papers and books in 20 languages on democracy, on critical theory, on sociology in France and Germany, and political representation. Recently, he has published The Commandment of Chains, Sortation and Democracy from Athens to the Present at Cambridge University Press. And he's preparing the handbook of statutory democracy, co-edited with Lionel Cordier for Elgat Handbooks. So very much, thank you very much, Yves, for being with us today and to discuss my work. And you know each other very well, so it's not the first debate you have.
Before this, we did like each other before we did this.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this possibility of discussing again with Graham. So thank you for the convenience of this masterclass. My problem was that I do agree with 95% of what Graham said. So I had two strategies. The first one was to add footnotes and questions which would have been footnotes. But it could have been boring, so I decided to play the advocate of the devil against Graham, but also against me, because I share 95%, as I said, of what he said. I would have four questions to Graham. The first question is more a procedural, but also a political question about the different types of assembly. You presented the different types of assembly, making differences between those who are organized by the government, those who are organized by civil society, asking the government to organize a citizen assembly, and those who are organized by a bottom-up movement without interest, or at least much beyond the state. But we could do something different, and this would be my first question. I think that we can differentiate between citizen assemblies for which impartiality is crucial, and the citizen assemblies which have been organized in Ireland are the most well-known example of this. In this perspective, it is crucial that the debates in the assembly is not politicized, that the members of the citizen assemblies don't discuss with other actors, with interests groups, be them political parties, lobbies, social movements. So in this case, everything is organized in order to preserve the non-partisan character of the assembly. And I guess that the French Citizen Convention for the Climate was quite different, because it was not that apolitical from the constitution of the organization committee to the advisory board, and to the contacts between the assembly members and civil society movements, especially ecological movements. This could be interpreted as a defect compared to the model of the impartial citizen assembly. It has been politicized, and so it's not good. Or it could be the opposite. Oh no, it's good that there is some kind of politicization, that the members, the citizens who are members of the Citizen Convention for the Climate could demonstrate with ecological movements and so on and so forth. And I had the feeling when you were explaining the last examples of the citizen assemblies that your eyes were, wow. No. So
I was giving away.
Is it better to have this kind of politicization, to have what a colleague and friend here has called the assembly model, namely the fact that the Assembly became an actor in the political game. Jean-Michel Fournier has proposed this, as opposed to the jury model, which is impartial. So, what is better at procedural level? To isolate the Citizen Assembly and its members from politics, or to put them in politics? And what about, for example, so it's good when it's Extinction Rebellion, but what about the Trump MAGA movement organizing a citizen assembly? So this is the first question. Is there a better type? The second question is about the link between citizen assemblies and the political system altogether. You have put the emphasis on the state or civil society. I would put this a bit differently. This is a more technical, but in the derivative democracy debate about citizen assemblies and mini-publics, there has been a shift from focusing on one instrument, participatory budgeting, citizen assemblies, public debate, to a more systematic view on democracy in general and derivative democracy in particular. So how are the different elements linked together in a democratic system and in a derivative system? This has been very interesting because it makes the thing more global. You don't just focus on one element, you are looking to the interactions between the elements. With a disadvantage, very often the system is conceived as something peaceful, coherent, functional, and this is my main problem with this kind of literature. The system is conceived as functional, like a division of labor. So you have different elements, they fit together. Some have some functions, others have other functions. Some are more deliberative, others are less deliberative, and you have criticized this with a colleague of yours. But the idea is, I think, good. It is a system, but what kind of a system? Is it a functional system, and is the division of labor the paradigm for thinking about the system, so the relation between the citizen assemblies and other elements? Or, and this would be my proposal, is the paradigm more the ecosystem, which has been worked in the ecology sciences, and which is quite different. I have no time to describe it at length, but perhaps the key elements is that in this perspective, you have constant imbalances, disturbance is normal, you can have relations of facilitation, complementarity, and competition between the elements, but also you have predation. You have predators and prey, you have invasive spaces, very strong tensions, and asymmetries. And for me, it's a much better paradigm in order to try to think the political system and perhaps also the deliberative system. And in this perspective, citizen assemblies can be conceived as some kinds of invasive spaces in this political ecosystem. But for sure, there are also other invasive spaces which are not particularly friendly. And so my second question is, what is your underlying vision of politics and the political system? Because I don't understand. Is it a functional division of labor, or do you conceive yourself as the main actor of these invasive spaces, which are, yeah. So this is my second question. The third question, well, you have developed this paradoxical alliance in a more English panorama, but if you put it in the French one, I mean, it was quite interesting to see that for the French Citizen Convention for the Climate, you had some parts of the Yellow Vest movement, some part of the ecological movement, and Emmanuel Macron, who wanted the Republic of Permanent Deliberation. Actually, it has been more of the Republic of Permanent Chaos. But you had these quite different actors. And in the title of your presentation, you asked, or no, not in the title of the presentation, but in the last part, how is it possible to make sense of this? And you have given an optimistic answer. This moment of coalition, improbable coalition of people. But at the end of the day, one could be more pessimistic or cynical. When it's organized by governments, it's like a trick. And when it's organized by civil society, it doesn't lead anywhere. So in the title, you say good governance of revolutionary confrontation with a carbon state. At the end of the day, you didn't give an answer. Is it the revolution against the carbon state, or is it just a trick of the good governance? This would be my third question. And the last question is, you have described this incredible development of citizen assemblies in the world, in the last, not in the world, especially in Europe, in the last couple of years. And I do share the same astonishment. The first time I spoke, I wanted to write about it, was for a book on Porto Alegre participatory budgeting in 2003, I guess, too. And my co-author, when I proposed this, told me, "Well, you are crazy, you have smoken the carpet." Speaking about sortition.
The wedding.
And no, I mean, we can discuss about this in a very impressive audience from Sciences Po and Paris-Cité University, very respectful and so on. But we've also changed. And we've also this authoritarian and conservative counter-revolution. How is it possible to make sense of this? At the same time, you have spoken about government and good social movements, but there are a lot of bad social movements and bad governance. So at the end of the day, it's much ado about nothing, beaucoup de bruit pour rien, or is it something which could make us optimistic or less pessimistic about the future? Thank you.